Hi, and welcome to Chapter 15. I wanted to put into context what's occurring in Chapter 15, because without some of these terms, you might be a little bit lost. So let's go ahead and jump into it. What we're going to talk about is aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So let me share my screen with you. Okay, so in aggregate demand and aggregate supply, what we're looking at, there we go, is we've talked about already in some previous objectives about economic activity. We've defined what a recession is. And again, that's an economic contraction where we have declining real incomes and rising unemployment. Okay. A depression is a severe recession. But again, we don't use that term very much anymore. Some key facts about economic fluctuations, as we said, that the business cycle is irregular, and unpredictable, okay? And we tend to see that these macroeconomic kind of quantities or qualities that we talk about can move together, okay? So again, as output or quantity falls, then unemployment will tend to rise. So here's some examples of the real GDP. And we do see an upward trend here, but note the red portions are periods of recession. And you'll see that we have dips here and here, the contraction in the economy. And so that kind of shows that real business, business cycle at work here. Here's investment spending. Remember, investment is in, for example, a new house, capital, accumulation of inventories would also be considered investment spending as well. And here we have the unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate moving countercyclical to the, excuse me, real GDP. We've discovered and really talked about all of this stuff in the short run, but we're also going to be talking more, we've talked about it mostly in the long run. And now what we want to do is to discuss the short run. And there are a couple of principles which you may have glossed over or we have not really covered because we skipped a few chapters. But this is the assumption of money neutrality. Money neutrality in the long run basically says that inflation does not impact real variables. However, in the short run, it does. So we see that real and nominal are highly intertwined in the short term, okay, 1 year. We also know and want to remember that changes in the money supply, which we're going to talk about in some later chapters, but changes in the money supply can push real GDP away from a longer term trend. So if we see real GDP declining, then we can see that the Fed will enact monetary policy, changes in the money supply, which will help put real GDP into a different trajectory. This aggregate demand and aggregate supply model is what we use to explain these short-term fluctuations. So the aggregate demand, and remember, aggregate demand is just consumption by households plus government spending plus investments plus net exports. And this would be, again, the exports minus imports. And it kind of captures these consumers abroad. The aggregate supply basically talks about the level and quantity of goods and services that are available, okay? And it's upward sloping. So here we have a good example. So here we have the price level, and by price level, what we mean is inflation or the consumer price index, which you've already studied. Here we have aggregate demand. which is consumption plus investment plus government expenditures plus net exports. It was GDP, right? Same kind of thing. What is the consumption of households and so on? Aggregate supply are those goods and services available. Where the two intersect, we'll have our equilibrium price level or our inflation. And we'll have the equilibrium output. Okay, so what would happen if we have a fall in the price level, a decrease in inflation? So we would say deflation here. And what's going to happen is it's going to increase the quantity of goods and services demanded. And there are three reasons for this. The first one is that consumers feel wealthier. Okay, if prices are declining, then you don't need as much money to support your current standard of living. So you have a little bit extra, you feel, and that extra, then you're going to want additional consumption. So that's our C portion as the inflation rate goes down. Interest rates, because if the price level decreases, then interest rates will follow the nominal interest rate. And this will stimulate demand for investment goods, things like new houses and so on. We also see that when the interest rate goes down, that currency, for example, the US dollar, as opposed to yen, will depreciate. So US goods become cheaper relative to foreign goods, and this will increase net exports because we will export more because our goods will seem cheaper to those in other countries, and that will help increase the net exports. If the price level increases, we have the opposite. So consumption would decrease. And again, if the price level is going up, this means we have inflation. Okay, it means the US dollar becomes less valuable. We also know that the price level is part of nominal interest rates. So that will decrease investment spending. People will not want to build new houses. Businesses will not want to expand factories and so on. Likewise, US goods become more expensive because currency appreciates relative to foreign. So US goods become more expensive. So we export less, import more. And that decreases overall net exports. So this price level is a driving factor, inflation, if you will, or deflation. So here's an example, and it's a pretty good one, I think, when we look at the price level. Here we're starting at a price level. Remember the consumer price index. What is inflation? Let's say 3% is inflation. And that, once we hit the aggregate demand, means that GDP, or the quantity of output, let's be real GDP, then is at Y1. If the inflation rate went down to 1%, then we can see that aggregate demand will increase. Okay, because we're going down. Again, aggregate demand as price level increases, the quantity of output is less. Now, what's stimulating aggregate demand? Remember the consumption from the wealth effect. Interest rates are lower, so we see more investment, plus net exports. Okay, because we are now exporting more and importing less. So this means that the quantity of goods and services demanded, or the demand for real GDP, will increase. sometimes the aggregate demand will shift. And this kind of makes sense when you think about why would people change consumption patterns? Why would we change what we buy? For example, if the US dollar, okay, so inflation is linked to the US dollar. So if inflation increases, the US dollar decreases, meaning the value of it. It takes more US dollars to buy the same amount of goods and services. So we will have a demand for money increasing. Okay. If inflation goes up, we've just talked about the changes in investment. If inflation goes up, that means that the nominal interest rate is going to go up, which means that people are not going to want to borrow, which means overall investment will go down. Changes in government purchases. Changes in government purchases would be at the federal level or at the state level. Okay, so it can affect it can affect the overall economy or just a section of the particular economy. And so we'll look at that in just a moment because this is where we get fiscal response. So if government purchases at the federal level increase, then that's going to shift the aggregate demand curve outward and to the right. Changes in consumption, in the example I gave here, the aggregate demand would shift inward. Investment, using the example I gave here, aggregate demand would shift inward. Changes in government purchases, using the example I gave here, aggregate demand would shift outward if government purchases increase. And changes in net exports, again, if I'm using inflation going up, the converse is also true, then basically the US dollar depreciates. Okay, and so we would export more, import less, and that too would take the aggregate demand curve and shift outward to the right. So any increase in aggregate demand, we're going to see it shift outward and toward the right. Any decrease is inward and to the left. So why does the demand curve slope downward? Again, the wealth effect, the price level. Notice the price level here, which is just inflation. If that decreases, then it increases the real wealth, and that will stimulate and consumption will increase. Aggregate demand then would shift outward and to the right. The interest rate effect, the lower price level, again, kind of using the example above, if the CPI goes down, that will reduce the interest rate, and that will increase investment, and that too will shift aggregate demand outward and to the right. The exchange rate effect, a lower price level. So again, if we have inflation decreasing, the real exchange rate depreciates, which stimulates spending on net export. So that's what we're saying is exports. Yeah, because the US dollar becomes worth less, not worthless, but worth less than it was before. So US goods become cheaper relative to foreign goods. So we export more. So that too would make aggregate demand shift outward and to the right. Wow, so lots of things here. So why might it shift? Again, the consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports. Now, we've been studying based upon that the long run aggregate supply curve is perfectly what we would call inelastic. And so the price level doesn't affect it in the longer term. And that's kind of what we've been talking about. But now I wanted to highlight the shorter term because your book's going to use in chapter 15 a lot of this aggregate information, and I wanted to make sure that you understood it. So here's long run aggregate supply because it's fixed at a particular point in time. So it doesn't really matter if the consumer price index or inflation decreases here. It doesn't really affect the natural level of output. Additionally, this is where the economy is in the long run. We would say unemployment's at its normal rate. We're at full employment output, and we talked about those things in our labor chapter. So I think this should make sense to you. So we have the natural rate of unemployment being achieved in this longer term. Now, sometimes the long run aggregate supply curve does shift. So this is a change in the natural level, and that could be, again, changes from our factors of production, labor, land, capital, and also technological knowledge, because those are things that are going to stay changed for the long run. So long run aggregate supply, if we have an increase in labor or a baby boomer, that might shift outward and to the right. Changes in capital, we have more businesses expanding. Why? Because investment is up. Why is investment up? Investment might be up because inflation is down, because that translates into the nominal interest rate. So what you want to do is to think of these things as a domino effect and what affects what. And that's kind of why I think your author does those causations so that you can clearly see the chain of what is happening to each thing. So again, just kind of the changes in labor, some of the things that we'll see, changes in capital, and then changes in natural resource. So weather can affect it if it's poor weather or if it's a good growing season. Also the availability of natural resources. And so why might the government allow drilling in federal lands or timber or lumbering on federal property? And again, this changes the natural resources, which if there's a more available to them, if there's more available to us, that would shift the long run aggregate supply curve outward and to the right. Again, changes in technology. You're seeing this in terms of internet and intellectual property rights and all kinds of different things that are happening in the economy as a whole. The terms of government regulation. Why did Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos have to testify before Congress? It was because of these changes in technology that we're seeing. The long run aggregate demand curve and aggregate supply curve could shift. Again, why? And this is where chapter 15 kind of starts to talk about monetary policy being one, which is set by the Fed. Okay, so if the Fed increases the money supply, here's the domino effect. So if the Fed increases the money supply, that means the value of a dollar decreases. If the value of a dollar decreases, that means inflation increases. If inflation increases, that means the nominal interest rate would increase. If the nominal interest rate increases, that means investment will decrease. That means aggregate demand will decrease, and so on. Okay. So here you just have a fancy graph showing some of those things which happen in long run aggregate supply curve and inflation. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more in chapter 15. So in the short run, the price level does affect the economy's output. So we're going to say that inflation has an impact on GDP. Again, if we see an increase in the overall level of prices, that will raise the quantity of goods and services supplied. Think of it this way: if you're a producer of products and the price in the market is going up, you don't care if it's inflation or not. And right now, in the shorter term, again, in the short run, that your inputs are fixed at current prices, then what we will see is you will tend to have, as a supplier, a bit of a wealth effect as well. Again, a decrease in the level of prices, then we're going to reduce the quantity of goods and services supplied, and that will impact aggregate supply. So here we go, again, kind of taking a look at this. Now, again, we're in the short run because everything will adjust. The cost of the factors of production will go down as a result of this. And so we'll talk about why this is sometimes seen more in the longer run. It might start in the shorter run. Okay, so what are the three reasons? And here we are. The sticky wage theory. And sticky wage theory basically means that wages are slow to adjust to things because we might have people under contracts, which are more longer term and so on. The sticky price theory basically says that some goods are slow to respond in economic or in business cycles. Okay, so relative price. So the idea is you can't automatically take the price that's increasing. So again, if inflation is increasing, that means the prices are going up. That means you can't take the price of that particular product immediately in some instances because of, again, contracts, things like that, and you can't pass that on to the consumer. So that's another reason why this aggregate supply curve shifts upward. The last one is misperceptions theory, and I want to make sure I get this right. And this basically is suppliers respond to changes in the short run aggregate supply curve. So basically what happens is they might believe that it isn't inflation at all, that it's their product's price. And so they might adjust output either outward or inward based upon the price that is occurring in the market, when in fact that price might be driven by inflation, not necessarily the value of the product becoming more or less valuable in the marketplace. Okay, so here's the sticky wage theory. If the price level, okay, is less than expected, then we're going to produce less output. If the price level is greater than expected, we're going to produce more. So when you see price in the sticky wage theory, basically think about the market price. And then what we want to be able to do is to take a look at, well, how much of that market price is driven by inflation and how much is driven by consumer demand? And we have to parse those out, because not knowing the difference, we might try to pass on price increases and it's more inflationary, and that's actually going to hurt us in the longer term. Okay. You don't really need to know that. Okay. So the aggregate supply curve will shift based upon things happening in the factors of production. Okay, so if the price level goes up, the aggregate supply curve will decline. So here we have aggregate supply, we have aggregate supply, and if the price level increases in the market, then what's going to happen is the aggregate supply curve, because we have an increase in the price level, that means our factors of production, the aggregate supply curve will shift inward and to the left. Lots of reasons why. Again, notice a lot of these are based upon our factors of production, because that's essentially what suppliers are doing, is taking the factors of production and using entrepreneurial ability to get output. And here we look at how might those things which impact the factors of production impact the aggregate supply curve, again, in the short run. In the long run, we actually will see that these two things intersect. So here's the short run aggregate supply. Remember, driven by factors of production and costs and always inflation. Aggregate demand driven by consumption plus investment plus government expenditures plus net exports, right? So aggregate demand and obviously inflation playing a part in the background. In the long run aggregate supply, where these two crisscross, will be long run aggregate supply. And this is the assumption that we've been using throughout the class, that it is constant. And we've been ignoring what happens in inflation in terms of short run aggregate supply and short run aggregate demand. Okay. I like this one for looking at macroeconomic fluctuations. I think it's a little bit beyond chapter 15, but I think it kind of makes sense. Again, here's a very complicated graph. It doesn't need to be so, but where are we going to start? So here we have aggregate demand 1, aggregate supply 1, where these two crisscross. So we're going to start here at A. Then what happens is we have a decrease in aggregate demand. Think about what would cause a decrease in aggregate demand. It might be that the price level is going up. So this would be inflation increasing. So consumption decreases, investment decreases, government purchases, I'm going to leave out of the equation, but it might decrease as well. Net exports decreasing. So basically what we have then is we have a decrease in the price level. Okay. What started it? An increase in the price level. But now that will shift aggregate demand down to P2, so a lower inflation. Okay, so aggregate demand shifts in. But when aggregate demand shifts in, then the short run aggregate supply curve will shift outward into the right. Price level going down makes that wealth effect where suppliers feel like they have more money because the inflation went down, but their prices are still the same because of wages being stuck, because of prices being stuck, and perhaps this is all a misperception. So they may think that, hey, we're making more money. So what's going to happen is we're going to shift the aggregate supply outward and to the right. And notice it comes back to the equilibrium, but at a lower inflation level. Now, again, this is a bit beyond where I wanted to go with this, but I do want you to have a basic sense of aggregate demands and aggregate supply. So remember, aggregate demand, anything that affects consumption, investment, government spending, net exports. Aggregate supply, anything that affects the factors of production of land, labor, capital, and we're going to add technology in there. So that was really what I wanted you to take away from this, because I didn't want you to get lost when your book starts to explain things in terms of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So I'll see you back in chapter 15 with learning objectives 1 and 2.